Hey there! Is today your first time here? Or maybe your first time in a while? If so, maybe you're wondering exactly who we are and what this church is all about. Well, we'd like you to know that we're a group of ordinary people who are on an amazing journey together, following Christ. Our guide is the Bible because it's the divinely inspired Word of God, and it will never take us in the wrong direction. Along the way, we hope you'll see that we are welcoming and spiritually passionate, and that getting to know you is a big deal to us. We know that the road is rough sometimes, but we'll work really hard to bring you practical and relevant messages to equip and encourage you through life's ups and downs. We want you to know that we care about this community, and we believe that it's our job to make it a better place. So, no matter who you are or where you've been, we're glad you're here with us today, and we hope that you'll join us on our journey, following Christ and living out His plan for us. So, welcome to church.
Welcome to Abundant Life Baptist Church, Wednesday night life group Bible study. And tonight I've invited Brother Jared Williams with us. And Brother Jared is from Ambassadors Across America. He's an evangelist, spoken in many churches all across America. And him and his family were instrumental parts of starting our church. And so we're very grateful for him and his family. But, you know, tonight we're going to continue on our series on monsters and things that really dig deep in a Christian's life. And there are some of the hindrances that we face, whether it's on the surface or whether it's in our hearts and in our souls and people don't see it. But I will say that tonight we're going to be talking about depression. And this is something that is very real, and it's something that everyone battles with, whether it's themselves or somebody else that's close to you is battling with it. But we all see it, the effects that it has, and we all see some type of remnants from it. And so I thought it was a very important topic to really discuss tonight. And so I've asked Brother Jared if you could kind of weigh in on some thoughts from your life and from ministry and some things that you saw from the depression side.
Sure. When I think of depression, you have to go back to kind of concrete and establish what we mean by depression. Just because a lot of times we'll say something that we are depressed, or we deal with depression when something doesn't go our way, and so we get upset. And if that's the case, then we're all depressed almost all the time, unless you are winning the lottery. But I looked up a definition of what depression means, and we're not talking about the Great Depression economics, or we're not talking about surveying or physical geography. We're talking about really in the mind, and not just in the mind, but the mental health aspect of it. And when we immediately say that, we have seen a lot of Christians and a lot of people in our day and age in Christianity really push off depression off to the side and say it's not real. And they'll say that because the word depression doesn't appear in the Bible. And so since the word doesn't appear, they'll say, well, that's really not a real thing. It's a new age psychiatric term. But I knew a pastor or an evangelist years ago that for a long time he would get up and preach, and his famous quote or statement would be, "I'm too blessed to be depressed." And every time he'd come to camp, he would say that phrase. He'd be like, "I'm too blessed to be depressed." And it was a nice, catchy slogan. But I remember one year that he had come to the family camp where my wife and I met, and when he got up behind the pulpit, he was a different man than what we knew before. And he started off by saying, "I used to say I'm too blessed to be depressed," until he went through depression. And he really understood that it is a real thing. To say it doesn't appear in the Bible, so it must not be real, is very dangerous. Rapture, the word doesn't appear in the Bible. A lot of words don't appear in the Bible. There are modern vernacular, but they are very real things. And the principles are in the Bible. So I just want to give the definition. And I have a Bible example that's very, very brief. But the definition of it is a condition of general emotion, dejection, and withdrawal. sadness greater and more prolonged than that warranted by any objective reason. Kind of like when I started to say that depression is much more than just bad news. Depression is something that haunts us and plagues us. I've heard people say that it could be a demon of depression. And though I can't see the spiritual war that's going on, none of us can, we could definitely probably adhere to a little bit of that it could be. It could be just a demon. It could be a lot of things. So I want to start by saying, when we talk about depression, I have gone through, and you could ask my wife, and she would tell you more times than I realize, dealing with depression. But I want to say, with laying the premise of it, if anyone were to give you a straight up concrete algebraic equation on how to deal with your depression in your life, I'm not saying I wouldn't listen to them. I would just be a little bit cautious, because I don't know that the same acting out of depression in somebody else's life is the same thing that led to mine. So if I could have the liberty to do this, I want to really just deal on a personal level with the depression that I've dealt with. And I could start by saying that a couple of years ago, and Pastor Scott and I talked about this earlier today on the phone, that there's a difference between dealing with a sin and being oppressed by a sin, being in bondage to a sin. And Romans is very clear about that there's a difference between just dealing with a little bit of it and it always constantly haunting you. And yes, there's bouts of depression. There are things that, you just feel alone, you are withdrawn, you just by yourself. We're talking more than being introverted. We're talking about a depressed state, an oppressed state. And there's those moments, but up until 3 years ago, 3 years ago, I could take you to the place. It was September. We had just finished a group of revival meetings, and we had come back to our home church in Somerset, Kentucky, and they were finishing off we called a revival meeting, but a pastor friend of mine from Pennsylvania was there preaching, and he was talking about some different things dealing with this, and I don't think he realized he was dealing with this in my life. And I realized that I was, we could call it clinically depressed. I knew these things, but I was so prone to being depressed that it was, you say, how do I know I'm clinically depressed or I'm prone to being depressed? If you take everything away, all the circumstances, and you slip into depression, then I would say you really struggle with it. And I could say that emphatically from my life, that you take all of the good circumstances away, you take every bad circumstance away, and it's just, instead of being content, or instead of being whatever sin you deal with on your own, you just slip off into a state of loneliness and depression, and you just want to stay in bed, not because you like the covers and the pillows so soft, but because it is just, you are just weighted down and you are alone and on the inside. Those commercials on TV are very real. Maybe not the actors, but that idea is very real. So I do want to say that, talking about this, if it's okay, just let it be personal. But a number of years ago, I didn't realize then the truth that was here, but there was a message that the Lord had given me to preach at different churches in revival meetings. And one of those this message specifically was out of Elijah's life. And it was a message, I didn't really have a title for it, but if there was a title, it would come straight from Scripture. When he says 3 different times from 1 Kings 18 to 19, he says this single phrase. And when I read it, it just jumped out of the page at me, saying Elijah dealt with being lonely and depressive. Not just lonely, but withdrawn and just, if you could understand how it is. You might say, preachers don't deal with this. Oh, very much so. Preachers very much, they say that the people that get up and they'll be on the mountaintop in front of other people, whether it be a comedian or whether it be a pastor, or whether it be a public speaker, that they will, as fast as they rise, they will hit rock bottom that quick. And that's a very, very real thing. Comedians are some of the most depressed people I've ever met in my life. And they're funny on stage, but when you get them away, it's like they just ride that roller coaster down. I understand that. But Elijah said this phrase, and this is not to get off on rabbit trails, keeping it simple, but as the fire came down on Mount Carmel, and God revealed himself to the children of Israel, and to the prophets of Baal, the prophets that ate at Jezebel's table, and right after that, Jezebel gives out a hit on his life, threatens his life, and so he goes and he hides in a cave. But during this time, he says a phrase when he's on Mount Carmel, he says a phrase when he's in the cave, and he says a phrase right after this. All of this time, he just keeps going back to this phrase, and that phrase is this: I, even I only, remain. And he says that phrase, I, even I only. And when I read that, it jumped out as if to say he was alone. He was by himself. And he felt that discouragement. I've heard a lot of people preach out of that next chapter about how he went to the cave and he was hiding. And we could say, well, why is he hiding? He's on God's side. And though that makes for good preaching, that if God be for us, who can be against us, that means we overcame depression. It goes deeper than that. At least in my life, it went deeper. And so I don't know if we want to dive into that right now yet. Just go ahead and go straight into it. Or
Well, let me ask you. So you're talking about depression, and you mentioned comedians and preachers, and we've seen Robin Williams. We had that was a major example, and personally, I don't know if he was a Christian or not. I don't know the man's heart, but I do know that he battled with depression, and as that unfolded in his life, and he took his own life because of it, we can see that obviously things in this world, money does not make us happy.
Yeah, it doesn't pull us. It's not the remedy to pull us out of depression.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of times, if you look at a lot of these college, ball players and stuff like that. Now we're both Ohio State fans here.
That's right.
And if you're from Michigan, I'm sorry, but anyway.
You're always depressed.
Yeah.
There's no remedy for that. But that's why it's very personal.
Yes. But we are both Ohio State fans, but you think about some of these guys that are coming in the pressure, that they're coming off of the field to perform, that one day they might actually be able to, play in the NFL. And so you think of people that you think, well, if they could ever just get to that point where they sign a contract, they're going to be the happiest people in the world. But it's actually just the opposite. Yeah. We've seen that a lot of these people that have made millions and even billions of dollars, they're still searching for, something. And many of them have struggled, just like Robin Williams, with that whole bout of depression and against God's desire.
Yeah.
They've taken their own life in many cases.
Well, suicide has skyrocketed, especially among public figures. And it doesn't mean you have to be in a public arena to experience depression at all. It's just maybe there's other moving parts to it, but depression it hits all walks of life, and to where you almost to survive, like an addict, yeah. They need that next hit, or they need that next high to survive. They're going from high to high, and it's the same thing with dealing with depression when we are depressed. And what I mean by that is they go from like their high of being I don't know, maybe outward would be like a preacher would be speaking from one engagement to the next, and in between,
right.
they bottom out.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about when you take those circumstances away. And I mean, there's been tons. There's a local comedian. I'm not going to say his name, but he was a local comedian for a few years, a Christian comedian, very funny guy. But he, after he started to get around the Dayton area, doing some comedy bits and very good, very just fantastic humor, he ended up moving and just secluding himself because he could not handle and he couldn't figure out how to deal with his depression. And his remedy to the depression was to change circumstances, and all it did was cover up. And he felt like he was dealing with the depression, but it just never left him. That's what Pastor Scott's saying.
Yeah.
That it's, I mean, you feel like, well, this is going to be the remedy. This is going to be the heal, but it's not. And I believe Scripture has a lot to say about it. But again, I want to keep this personal because I don't want to give a blanket statement to where people would automatically just think, well, if it works for him, it works for me. No, I'm just going to maybe share a little bit about my battle with depression.
Well, so in saying that, I will say my bouts that I've had, I really haven't struggled with depression. As we have talked, as much as you have in some of your life, my depressions have been more probably situational depression, is what, if that's even a thought. It was more surface. It wasn't something, a struggle that was deep down inside of me, but it was something that emotionally I was struggling with. So I don't even know that I can maybe say that I've really battled with depression, because it's been more situational type things. But I have struggled at times with what I guess it would be more minor depression. But the same things that struggled with me, and the same things that brought me out of depression isn't necessarily even remotely the same of what you've gone through or the answer to what you've got. So let me ask you this. What is some of, where did your depression, how do you feel like the first step that from your sake, from the depression, where did some of that originate?
Well, I guess time-wise, the way that it originated, I guess how it manifested itself.
Yeah.
Is that kind of, how it showed itself to be, how it showed its ugly head was through discouragement. And I always heard preaching that discouragement leads to depression, and depression will lead, much like lust leads to sin, sin leads to death. And they say it's like a digressing. And that could be true for some people, but I realized that discouragement was not the start of depression for me, but it was the manifesting of depression.
Gotcha.
It was how depression showed itself out in my life, because no one knew, other than my wife could see it, but she would see the discouragement. She would see in the word discouragement, it appears like a handful of times in the Old Testament where the children of Israel were discouraged to do something. But then it also says, and I have this pulled up, where it's talking about the family in Colossians, and it says, children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing of the Lord. But then it says, fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. And that discouragement is like stopping someone. It means to take their spirit away from them. And this discouragement on the outside was my manifestation of depression. And once I realized that, I guess my wife has a lot to do with how that came to be, because she realized that I dealt with this, and her way out of love for me to get victory over it was to say, all right, you need to go do all these different things, go run or ride a bike, or you just need to go and you need to be busy. As long as you're busy, then you won't be discouraged, and which is true. But it's almost like I realized that the symptoms were just being suppressed.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that negative about my wife. She was she cared about me, and she wanted me to just be fixed, But I realized that I could fix all the outward, what would you call them? The symptoms?
The surface.
The surface, yeah.
Right.
We could fix all of those things, but the depression did not leave. And when I talk about the 3 years ago at that meeting, I was standing in the church parking lot, and I realized that God, it was after the service that night, and I realized that God was diving deeper into, and I was asking, God was showing me why I was discouraged. And I was discouraged because I was depressed. And as I began to unravel that onion, nobody wants to think about onions, but as I unraveled that outside was discouragement, the inside was depression, but then we have to ask the question, I did for myself, where does the depression come from?
Yeah.
And for me, the answer was, it's either I'm born this way, I'm born, and I'm depressed because it's genetic. Or you could say it's a spiritual issue. And maybe genetics plays a little bit into you being prone to the spiritual issue of depression, but for me, it was a spiritual issue. And it came to light through another passage of Scripture, and I hope it's okay to share these. And if we could make it as simple as can be, this is just me sharing my heart of testimony with you. But in Hebrews, this is what was preached on that week, and it's not ironic. It's just neat. But in Hebrews chapter 12, the writer of Hebrews says, looking diligently in verse 15, lest any fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Lest there be any fornicator or profane person as Esau, who for one morsel of meat sold his birthright. Now, from here, you'd say, well, what does this have to do with depression? And this is where it gets very personal for me. Where my depression, God was showing me that I was depressed because my heart, there was something, a very core issue in my life that had and was bringing this depression back all of the time to me, and that was a heart issue I had against God. I didn't realize that. But the way that it manifested itself, and I want to share this before we go on. I know I'm talking a lot.
No, you're good.
We found ourselves going from ministry to ministry to ministry to ministry, and I'm not talking about for revival meetings, but we were going from being very involved at one church. We'd have a home church that when we dive into, then we would dive into the next home church, and all of those ministries that that God was making very much a part of our life. We kept finding one thing in common, that before we left, things would go bad, or things would be said, and I found myself getting hurt. And it was like, then I'd deal with that hurt, and we'd be like, okay, forgive, and I'd forgive the hurt, and then we'd go to this next ministry, and it would be like the same thing over and over again. It'd start off good, the circumstances were good, and then it would take a turn of reality maybe, and then I'd get discouraged, I'd get depressed, and that depression would just show itself as discouragement, and my wife got to the place where she'd be like, oh, here we go again, we're going to leave this ministry, and I'd get hurt, and then we go to this, and it was a cycle over and over again that, we were getting hurt, and in my mind, I was the victim. And I was the victim that just kept getting hurt, and I could justify it in a lot of ways by saying, well, we're being like Christ, and Christ was spit on, and he was bruised. I did that for a long time, until that night in the parking lot, the Lord was grasping my heart, saying, as I'm asking him, why do I keep getting hurt? Why all this? And he goes, You ever think that you're the problem? And I began to look at my life and diving into some very deep issues that were not dealt with. And so for me, it was bitterness. Why do I keep getting hurt? Because I had this bitterness, and that was leading me to depression, this bitterness, where I would look at other people. I'd look at them and I get, like, why does things have to be good for them, and why not us? I'd look at the other ministries, and it took me to this passage where it talked about Esau and Jacob. And I went back and I studied, and I've preached out of that passage before because it's so powerful, especially what God did in my life. That Esau it wasn't that he committed fornication in the way that we think, but it was that he was not faithful to his birthright. Yeah. And so he sold his birthright for a small price. And then you look at the story that goes there, and it talks about a root of bitterness. That whole picture in Hebrews 12 shows us that bitterness sprang up in his life. And that small seed of bitterness, that small seed that turned into a root that you couldn't see, had manifested itself. And for me, it went back to bitterness that I hadn't dealt with.
Hey, this is Pastor Scott. I just want to thank you for joining with us tonight. And part 2 will be next week, Wednesday at 7 o'clock. I want to invite you back to watch us online. And if you don't have a church home, I want to encourage you to come visit us this coming Sunday at 11 a.m. and in person. And God bless you. You have a good week.